Mr. Professor Garicano Gabilondo. Can you explain to us what would be your first, most essential thing you want to talk about?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, my main concern would be not to throw the baby with the bathwater, like the Americans say, meaning we are going through a crisis after very prosperous decades that we had after World War II, with a very wide consensus, with societies united, with reforms. The Netherlands, for example, with the administrations in which Mr. Bolkestein was, and Koch and so on. And now the pendulum seems to go in the opposite direction. People are saying that instead of markets, we should go to state aid and state intervention and no competition, but facilitated monopolies. I think that nobody thinks that after this crisis, the state should have the right to limit a freedom of movement or indefinitely. This is an exceptional thing we're doing now. And similarly, I don't think we should take from this special moment the lesson that the state has to intervene all over the place. There are two problems, I think two, and no more, that we need to tackle: climate change and increasing inequality. And we can do those two problems by working through the market, not by increasing arbitrariness, not by forgetting the lessons of the 60s and 70s. As we know, we defend the market not because it's just freedom, but because the market is the only way to harvest local knowledge and to make sure that innovation goes forward. People who know what is needed are the people who are on the front lines, not some bureaucrat in some ministry. We shouldn't just suddenly change our minds about that.
Clear.
So we have to harness the market to make changes, and that means, in my opinion, companies should maximize profits. Given the companies the objective of doing something else simply allows managers to give themselves a big salary and say, "Well, I didn't make a lot of money, but I was doing some other thing." I think we should. I mean, taxation of wealth. I do agree with that bit that was mentioned. I think that we should harness the market to fight climate change, and that's the emission trading scheme, a very successful scheme that we need to expand worldwide. And we should make sure that the welfare system works without many distortions. And that means not means-tested welfare that introduces all sorts of problems, but just the general safety net that benefits all citizens and that allows citizens to maintain their freedoms.
Europe must impose reforms to make it possible to hold firms judicially accountable for their social mission statement or their purpose. Could I ask Mr. Professor Gabilondo, to respond to that first?
Luis Garicano, the Spanish have two family names.
So sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So no, strongly no, very strongly no. I think that, in my opinion, I think that what Luigi Sincades was pointing out, which is to try to encourage firms, to try to tell firms or to help them, to push them in the direction of certain actions, is perfectly fine. To make the judiciary accountable for something as vague and as difficult to measure, like their social purpose, is, I think, counterproductive, because it will increase uncertainty. It will increase the ability to play games by directors. Contrary to what the statement seems to think, a CEO who has a very simple way to be evaluated, which is he maximizing profits, is he seeking good opportunities, etc., is more accountable than one where we say, well, you should do the good for society. I mean, he starts spending money in things that he likes, like making, better buildings and spending money in luxurious buildings for his company. And then he can say, well, I was being green, etc., etc. You can't really measure that. So I think it would be a huge step forward, and I would oppose that.
Professor Garicano Gabilondo, what is your response to this, and what is your response to what Professor Boeria said as well?
Well, the first, on your statement, I would think that this is correct, that we should shift to the extent possible taxes in the direction of wealth. And particularly, as you were pointing out from one of your previous panelists, towards housing, which seems to be a place where a lot of the distortions have taken place in the past. On Mr. Boris, on Tito Boris' point about means testing and basic income, I do agree that you can do means tested, and I mean I'm exaggerating when I say we should do something totally not means tested. What I fear is that we are seeing a proliferation of different little schemes with housing, school, and electricity entitlement, etc., that have the result overall of putting a huge tax on labor. Basically, what we see in Europe is that working, basically, in many of our countries doesn't pay. It's better to be, when you are receiving a lot of these benefits and when you have huge social security taxation on people who work, the result is that it's better not to work, or it pays very little to start working.
Yes.
My view then would be that we need to try to remove all those distortions. I mean, I moderate a bit in agreement with Tito. I moderate a bit my saying about non-means testing, but basically reducing that interventionist kind of the state trying to get into the life of each person to see whether they need this and that and this and the other benefit, and trying to have something a little bit more broad that allows us to help those who need it.
Thank you. So not have the state involved in every part of everybody. Let's move on to the last thematic threat that we've unveiled in this entire series, which is the green transition. So all of our speakers in one way or another have argued the necessity to limit economic activities that threaten to destroy our livelihood and our habitat on Earth. For example, Julia Steinberger advocates a degrowth strategy. She takes a self-proclaimed radical stance and thinks that it's impossible to curtail damaging economic activity enough within a for-profit capitalist logic. The current system, she says, favors and produces consumption, and every added unit of consumption is irreconcilable with the necessity for less growth. And Pettifor, on the other hand, praises the European Green Deal. Governments should take the lead in the green transition, since we cannot rely on firms to take measure in their own hands within the necessary time frame. She advocates a green growth strategy. And lastly, Jeffrey Sachs, he takes yet another approach. He analyzes the challenges of achieving economic growth while protecting the environment and achieving an equitable distribution of resources. And he favors an approach along the lines of SDGs, the Social Sustainable Development Goals, which he co-developed, obviously, which is also a green growth strategy. Now, this brings us to the third and final proposition, which I'd like to pose you all. Europe must implement reforms that stimulates consumers and businesses towards degrowth. Professor Garicano Gabilondo, let's start with you. What do you think of this proposition?
No.
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 All right.
Strongly no. Let me say why. So I think there are two strands in the environmental movement, among the green movement. One is the, let's say, Greta Thunberg strand that wants us to all have our own apple tree and eat our own apples by our garden in our house, and that's it. And there's another strand that says growth is necessary and we need to all kind of make sure that that growth is greener. The first thing I want to say is that I think the first view is incompatible with our current system. I think that everything from pensions to debt to social security to it requires a certain amount of growth to be sustainable. But also notice that contrary to what one of the persons that you mentioned that supported this, I don't remember who it was, a woman who supported the degrowth strategy, the first speaker that you mentioned.
Yes.
Consumption, she said, well, every unit of consumption damages the planet. Notice that is not really the case, because consumption is increasingly massless. We are now consuming, viewers who are watching this are consuming video. There is no atoms involved, no CO2 has been used. My kids are playing on their phone computer games. The presents that I do them for Christmas don't have mass. I give them a present which is a video game that they download and that they play. Another present can be music, which is on Spotify. We don't make LPs, we don't make books, we don't make, most of the things we're not making anymore.
All right.
I would say if you wanted to weight GDP, to weight in a scale, the GDP today versus the GDP 110, 50 years ago, I wouldn't be surprised if it's lighter. because a lot of the GDP we produce, certainly per unit of per dollar, it's lighter, that's for sure. Think about Facebook, the big companies that have grown, Facebook, Google. I mean, they don't produce anything. They produce electrons. And electrons don't really pollute the environment. Okay, there is some energy that is used, but it's minimal. The energy to produce a Kindle book and download it compared to the energy to produce an old-fashioned thick book, all the trees that go into paper, etc.
Clear, yes.
So the second point is consumption does not necessarily mean we kill the environment. And I think there's something much easier than this degrowth strategy, which is a system that we have in Europe that we have to substantially improve, which is the emission trading scheme. We have a scheme that says we have a certain amount of carbon that is allowed. People pay for this carbon. They can trade. So the one that has a lower cost of reducing the carbon consumption does the investment. And we, between all of us, we decrease little by little in Europe how much carbon is produced until we get to zero by 2050 or 2040, or maybe even earlier, who knows, if we decide to tighten the standards Europe-wide.
Yes.
So we need to expand this to the rest of the world. Happily, China, the biggest news this year that was covered by COVID has been that China has joined this effort, and China was our biggest worry. China is going to introduce an ETS to have a hugely ambitious global warming target, CO2 reduction target. And my view is that these two things are going to be compatible. We're going to invest a lot, and that's going to produce growth into the Green Deal, into reducing pollution, and we have to go in that direction. If we tell our citizens, we want you to stop going on holiday because we want to degrow, and we want you to stop buying stuff because you want to degrow, we will have the gilets jaunes. I mean, the proposition you, like in France, the proposition you put on the table, in my view, would be politically and economically unsustainable.
Professor Garicano Gabilondo, you've mentioned in your opening statement you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Do you believe the European Green Deal, just like Mr. Noels said, is too much top-down, possibly, and doesn't make the full use of the entrepreneurial potential in Europe?
It remains to be seen. I understand his concern, and I think it's well taken. I think there is a risk that there are no impact assessments and things are taken in too dirigist manner. But I think we are still on time to make sure that those investments are smart. I think the absence of the UK from the European Union is a bad news for the ideological balance of the Union. We have a clear move towards a system that has much more dependence on centralized solution, as Geert Noels said. And we know, I mean, why do we live in capitalism? Apart from freedom, we believe that local knowledge is the base, that people know what Geert is calling the entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, people know what they want when they go to the shop and they decide that they don't want coffee because coffee is too expensive. We don't have to decide who doesn't buy coffee when there is a freeze in Brazil. People who don't like coffee as much switch to tea, and people who are depending on coffee stay on coffee.
Yes.
And we need to use those kinds of mechanisms for greening. And the best mechanism we have is the ETS. Let me just tell you, like, I'm working. I wrote the opinion for the economics committee of the European Parliament, and I'm working on something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which basically tries to expand the ETS, but making sure that people outside the Union have to pay. Countries outside the Union have to pay for the carbon that they used if they didn't pay in their home country. That's the kind of smart policy that expands this ETS and that makes sure that everybody has at the end to make those efforts to green the environment.
Yeah, it's clear that we should host a debate between the two of you. Let us go to Professor Garicano Gabilondo.
I have no doubt, and it's one that comes also in the first statement by my colleague Tito Boeri, And I know it's a harder one to say in the Netherlands. Corporations in Europe are not paying taxes. This is big corporations. Let me just give you an example. Netflix 2 years ago paid total taxes in Spain of 2,000 euros. Any little bookstore in Madrid, any little kiosk in the Ramblas paid more. In Barcelona, paid more taxes than Netflix paid in Spain. This is true for Netflix, it's true for Apple, it's true for Google, it's true for many, many other companies. Yeah. It's not only internet companies, it's also true for Nike or for Starbucks, who had all the beans that they were selling in the UK produced in a hugely coffee-producing country, yes, which is Luxembourg and Switzerland. I mean, these are the places where coffee gets grown in Europe. Everybody knows that because of their tropical climates. So not, of course. So we have a real problem there of equity, of distribution, of resources for our welfare states. And we open up the capital mobility before solving this. And I would encourage you to drop some of those most crazy kind of statements and think of this question, which I know it's more controversial in the Netherlands, but it's extremely important for the future of Europe, in my opinion.